So which armies are shaping up to be some of the strongest in Warhammer 40k going forward? Let's talk about some early impressions after the data slate. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd talk about a few of the armies in Warhammer 40k that are perhaps shaping up to be some of the strongest going forward. It's now been a week or so for the dust to settle on 40k's last big balance update, the one with the balance data slate, a few points changes, and a few other more core things, so I thought it could be interesting just to talk through a few of the armies that are maybe shaping up to be better than before, and might be some of the ones to look out for most going forward. Compared with pre-update, Warhammer 40k in general was remaining about as well balanced between factions as it's basically ever been. The vast majority of armies between Games Workshop's previously stated 45 to 55% win target, and for a while now the game's been in a good position where the exact choice of faction matters a fair bit less versus the choice of list that you play with it, the player skill with the army, and the format that you're playing in. Though as normal, there were definitely armies that were doing better or worse than each other on all the metrics, and the two that were most clearly doing better than most last time were the Genestealer Cult and Astra Militarum, both on very high win rates and taking home a whole load of tournament trophies, though they've both been nerfed in their own ways. I feel like the majority of changes that Games Workshop made in the balanced data slate seemed sensible enough. Mostly when armies were looking a bit strong, they got nerfs in one way or another, or if they were looking too weak, they got various buffs, even if I feel like not everything went the right way. Sisters of Battle got far too many nerfs, and it was kind of weird to see Drukhari getting a bunch of nerfs as well, given that they weren't particularly standout before. For this video though, I thought it would be interesting just to talk through a few of the factions that are perhaps looking stronger than most currently. And while I feel like the top armies aren't really going to be all that far ahead of the main field, for this one I thought I'd just focus on 4 of the armies that seem like on paper they could be some of the strongest around, and why that might be the case. I'll talk through a bunch of honourable mentions after that, and obviously this is all really quite speculative at the moment, particularly with a massive wave of new Grotmas detachments to add to the mix. It'll be interesting to see what armies, detachments and combos rise to the top in the future. Jumping straight into it, and first up, I feel like a lot of people are looking out for Necrons, who seem to have taken some really quite big nerfs to their best list, but also seem to have another powerful army to step up to replace it. Pre-update, they were certainly one of the stronger armies of Warhammer 40k, win rates sort of middling around about 51% or so, but they did seem to be one of the factions that was doing better at actually topping grand tournaments and things, and doing better at a high level of play. Hypercrypt Legion still being the single most popular, though Awakened Dynasty and even Obeisance Phalanx also having some success too. After a few waves of points adjustments, quite a lot of Necron units were being quite viable as well. It was quite cool seeing lists take some very different varieties of different combos of Necrons, even if there were still a few staples. For their changes, they took some big nerfs to Hypercrypt. Now the number of units that you can put back in reserve is reduced, and the 3-inch Deep Strike stratagem now became a 6-inch one. Plus took a couple of nerfs to Hexmark Destroyers and Catan as well. I feel like that is kind of a heavy blow to the amount of movement shenanigans that you can do with it, and you might have a fair few more people looking elsewhere, even if it still seems playable to me. In general though, internet discussion seems to be really quite focused on that Star Shatter Arsenal detachment that they got out of the Grotmas ones. People are seeing it as perhaps the single strongest of the Grotmas detachments so far, particularly with its power with things like Doomsday Arcs and the Silent King, but also just having some fairly good support rules for other stuff on the side. Briefly for what it does, that gives you a +1 to hit enemies on objectives and the assault keyword on non-titanic vehicles or mounted units. The +1 to hit thing can just help out anything though, and the enemy will need to put units on the objectives, otherwise they won't be scoring much primary. And discouraging people from putting units on objectives could actually be quite a big thing for scoring you more victory points or denying some. Then the stratagems are just all really quite powerful, +1 to wound enemies on objectives, -1 to wound for non-titanic vehicle or mounted, making both Doomsday Arcs or Silent King dead tough, and Auto Advance 6, which works well with the assault keyword, and move through terrain 1 so you can have the Silent King suddenly bursting through walls. The ability to activate reanimation protocols at the end of your fight phase, so basically a double reanimation there, and if you combine that with a Canoptet Reanimator, that's essentially 8 wounds piled back onto one thing. Again, pretty massive for the Silent King or any big tough units. That could be incredibly nasty with Catan as well, and also a rather nasty reactive move of 6 inches after being shot, going down to D6 inches if it's not a detachment unit. But again, that one's kind of horrendously disruptive for enemy shooting. You could potentially be trying to focus down, say, a Doomsday Arc, and then after the first unit's shot, it just moves out of line of sight. Then, as if that all weren't enough, you can have a reroll 1s to hit and wound aura. You could make a Catacomb Command Barge, basically a mini Silent King with that, and ignores cover 1, and -1 damage for a nearby non-titanic vehicle or mounted one. And that one just seems incredibly hard to take down if you pair that with the Silent King and the -1 to wound one, potentially meaning that he could be really quite bold and move up, maybe supported by reanimators to ping him back to full health when you inevitably fail to kill him. Overall, it's quite a lot of scary stuff. All of that can be then applied to the good Necron units, Doomsday Arcs are just very scary at 190 points. I was kind of surprised they didn't go up a bit in the last update. Just good long range anti-tank fire, plenty of nice closer range shooting, and lots of survivability with that 4+ invulnerable save and a bunch of wounds. The Silent King himself is certainly played in competitive lists, both massive anti-tank shooting, some good melee, and reroll once to hit and wound nearby again. As mentioned, the reanimators will be good when you can threaten double reanimations. The Catan can actually make some very good use of some of the stratagems like that +1 to wound, or the reroll aura, or again the healing, and it seems nice enough for Locust Destroyers or Locust Heavies as well, given the mounted synergies. I feel like Imitate the Stormlord could be a good one as well, just to feed all those stratagems, as they've got so many powerful ones, even if it will be weird to have both him and the Silent King in the same army. In any case, just starting out with the Silent King and 3 Doomsday Arcs, and filling out the other 1,000 points from there seems like a pretty scary start. I feel like this Necron detachment is going to give people a lot of trouble. Before we move on, I'll just give a quick shout out to this video sponsor in Titan's Terrain, one option to get a cheap and transportable Warhammer 40K battlefield all in one box. Their terrain's quite different to most of the others out there. The idea is that you have 12 different tiles all laid out in a 45 by 60 inch grid, so that makes enough for a 2,000 point 40k battle, and then each of the tiles folds out and a building pops up out of it, so you basically have a cardboard terrain set that can fold completely flat, and if you've got limited space to store it, you can put it all in one box. It's easier than most to transport from place to place if you're going round to, say, play a game with a friend or something. In any case, that'll be linked down in the video description, and I'll cycle back to it at the end of the video to talk through their range a little bit more. It does have its pros and cons versus other terrain sets out there, and won't be the best choice for everyone, but I think it does have its selling points, with the storage pre-made and being fairly cheap compared with GW. In any case, thanks to them for sponsoring this one. Next up, for another army that feels like it'll be in a good spot, are the Death Guard, that feel like they were having some good performance prior to the update, and then while some of their top competitors got nerfed, they didn't really lose anything, so it feels like they could be in a good position to rise up against the competition as a result. Pre-updates, they were winning around about 53% of games, so fairly solid there, but also seem to be putting in some good performance at the top of tournaments, 6 big event wins and a whole bunch of high placings. They're doing quite well at the metrics that track that, so at least on paper feel like they could be in a good position for more. While a few things got buffs in one way or another, I feel like the top end of 40k generally got more nerfs than it did buffs. Guard and Genestealer Cult both a fair bit reduced, as this is a battle taking a massive nerf, and not really all that much seems to have risen up to replace them. It feels like the majority of the Death Guard roster is really quite playable at the moment as well. Mortarion tends to be in just about every top list at 300 points, it's just kind of hard not to include for that cheap. Then Typhus also tends to be an auto-include at 80 points, usually with at least 2 blocks of Death Shroud. Again, just enormous damage and defense stats there, even if they're not that fast, and potentially could rapid ingress to get them into close combat. Then they usually tend to be backed up by character-supported Plague Marines and Rhinos, skirmishing over the mid-board objectives with Biologist Putrefiers or Blight Spawns. A good few Demon Engines or tanks to do a little bit of heavy lifting, and then often taking some allies where their detachment rule can actually work quite well with them. Nurglings are popular for a bit of infiltrate, and yet another debuff on the enemy. War Dogs and in particular Brigands tend to do quite well. Maybe Nuisance Beasts of Nurgle. A few top lists seem to be taking Rottages these days as well. I guess he feels like he could be a similar sort of weight threat to Mortarion for fairly cheap, and is going to stretch the enemy damage output even more. Overall, between all that, it seems like they're just in a pretty good place to continue what they're doing. Even if I don't really feel like the changes really help them all that much. Mortarion can deep strike, but it probably doesn't make sense to most of the time. Predator Annihilator's got a small boost, and they got their Flyblown Host, though I still think that the Index Detachment is likely going to be the stronger one. Next up, I still feel like the Genestealer Cult are probably going to be one of the ones that are in contention. By the tournament stats and numbers, they were just massively well ahead of the rest before, getting 60% win rates at big tournaments and a huge amount of victories relative to their small player base, around about double the big tournament wins of any other faction out there. Aside from the Imperial Guard last time around, they were also doing this with multiple different playstyles as well. Biosantic Brood Surge, Outlander Claw and Host of Ascension all having a lot of draws to them, so it does feel like they're in a good position where they could fall back on one or another of those if any one of them was toned down too much. As mentioned though, they certainly were one of the armies that got nerfs. Probably the most impactful change might be the one to Cult Ambush, though to me it felt like more sort of small to medium nerf as opposed to devastating. Probably reducing the overall power of the rule, but at the same time giving you more control over it and more reliability. So it definitely feels like it's got some good opportunities for people who know their army well and know the exact places to use it best on. You no longer get the chance to recycle every single unit every single time it dies, but with those resurgence points, you get to choose the exact units that you want, maybe up to something like 15 pure strains or 25 acolytes over the course of a game, or various other similar combos, and you've got a bit of insurance against your first few rolls going poorly, as you can just have it be the first units to die that get respawned if you want to, so they've got more chance to be more impactful on the game. I still say it's a nerf overall, but still feels like a really big and powerful mechanic, and the units can just ping back straight into the opponent's face and be dealing damage the very next turn again. Otherwise, beyond that, they got a small scattergun of nerfs. Abominants went up 20, making them really quite inefficient now, and not being so good for running solo and Biosantic Brood Surge. I'd just guess they won't get played as much as a result. The Kellamorph's reactive move was toned down just a touch, so that now there is a distance where the opponent can approach them and not have them trigger the shoot and move thing. And perhaps one of the low-key biggest nerfs they got was to the Achilles Ridge Runner, going up 10 points, as that was perhaps one of the single most efficient datasheets that they had. Several lists were taking quite a few of those, so that could have an impact. Otherwise, for detachments, Outlander objective control got reduced, and the 3-inch drop from Host of Ascension got toned down to 6 inches, though demo charges in general got a small range boost to compensate a bit, perhaps so you could still use them out of that deep strike ability. Overall, it does feel like they took a nerf to each one of their detachments and for the army rule more generally. But to me, no one of those nerfs really seems killer. I feel like there'll probably be a more high-skill army to play properly again, rather than just perhaps coasting on the sheer amount of units coming back, and certainly weaker than before. But at first impression, my guess is they'll still be winning some tournaments and getting some pretty good win rates, just maybe a bit more in line with other top factions as opposed to being completely standout. I guess we'll wait and see how that pans out though. Lastly, for the main armies that I wanted to focus on, I do kind of wonder if Ultramarines, with the buffs that they got, might be suitably scary enough that they could be considered one of the top factions after the changes. I feel like this one's maybe a little bit less certain, just given that they did get quite a few nerfs as well as buffs, and Space Marines tend to have kind of weird statistics with tournaments that get warped for a whole bunch of things. For Ultramarines armies managing to actually win tournaments though, they did have quite a lot of success before the balance update, winning 4 big tournaments, most of them with Rabute Gilliman, and it maybe feels like the lower win rates of Space Marines in general were perhaps a bit more due to the other chapters out there, who just don't get quite as many powerful support character options as the Ultramarines, and still probably feel that way to be honest, even if some of their characters give out some extra objective control now. As mentioned, it does feel like Space Marines had some positives and negatives, though the +1 to wound that they got from Oath of Moments was just kind of enormous. If the enemy has big tough heavy hitters that are wanting to tank damage, they'll now just be far easier to take down for literally all the army, and it's particularly good for lower or mid-strength weapons. Things like Hellblasters are really like this, and same with things like Redemptor Dreadnought Macroplasmas, or even Eradicators. Gilliman went up to 345 points, so again somewhat of a side grade there, but he got 2 absolutely enormous buffs. First up, his double Oath ability now got a lot better given that you get +1 to wound with Oath of Moment, meaning that it's just far more worth it to have 2 copies of it rather than 1. You could be wiping out something really big and important in the shooting phase very easily, and then do the same in the fight phase. And perhaps even more importantly on top of that, he can now use that as well as his free stratagems instead of. So if he's in the centre of a list, he could be handing out some big damage dealer stratagem in your own turn, and then either Armour of Contempt or Overwatch or something in the enemies, and just feels like he's going to be permanently adding a massive amount of both damage and utility to an army list that he's in. He's still a massive chunk of points, but I think he's going to be worth it, and later in the game he can absolutely get his good melee stat line to work. Otherwise, beyond that, they got a bunch of improved datasheets. Intercessors seem absolutely excellent anti-horde now, in addition to their objective stuff. Sternguard just got the ability to spam out a whole load of mortal wounds against the Oath of Moment target, and Outriders, Heavy Intercessors, Reavers and Infernus Marines all made them more interesting, and buffed combat knives were handy enough for a few more units too. Despite all that though, there were a whole bunch of nerfs too. Armour of Contempt isn't as good against shooting things, Scouts are an extra 5 points, even if they did get some better blades. Fire Discipline became less of a combo for Gladius, and that was just a big nerf for Gladius in general, and for the Ultramarines specifically, both Calgar and Uriel Ventress increased, and they were the other 2 most commonly taken characters alongside Gilliman. Overall, between all that, my guess is that Space Marine win rates will improve a good chunk, given that there's now a much better reason to actually take them over the Divergent chapters. Maybe their win rates in general might be kind of middling, but I suspect that Ultramarines will be taking down a few more big tournaments. I'd guess maybe Vanguard Spearhead and maybe Ironstorm with Rabute Gilliman might be the ones that do best. It'll be interesting to see how the big changes affect army list building. Those are perhaps the main 4 armies I wanted to focus on, though I feel like in reality 40k is still going to be really quite well balanced. As I said at the start of the video, I feel like just about every faction will be able to compete, absolutely certainly at a casual level, and just about all of them still do well at big tournaments as well. We had just about every single army winning at least one event in the last few months, I still don't think the Guard are going to be going anywhere too far from the top. They did take some fairly broad points increases, and they might be pushed a bit more towards tanks, but they still have plenty of strong stuff up until when their Codex comes out, when I guess they'll change more. Chaos Demons still had high win rates, so I feel like they'll still be stomping a bunch of games. They didn't tend to win quite as many actual big tournaments though, even if they did still have some success there. Again, they were sort of unchanged when their top competitors got hit, and maybe they might find some use for that Slaneshi detachment. Admech looked like they could like that new Halo Screed detachment, maybe they'll get a bit more use out of that. Tyranids will enjoy their cheaper Norns, and Assimilation Swarm actually looks like something that you could play a bit more credibly now. Chaos Marines I think will enjoy their creations of Bile Detachment. That feels like it could genuinely be one of the competitive ones, and it seems to have had at least one good performance at a tournament already. And again, while they don't tend to win quite as many big events, I think Imperial Knights, Chaos Knights and Leagues of Votann will all be forces to be reckoned with. Chaos Knights had already won a whole bunch of big events in the last updates and got a buff detachment rule plus some cheaper War Dogs. Imperial Knights were already doing pretty solidly for win rates, had already taken down one enormous tournament, and just getting 10 points off their armigers feels like a massive injection of strength. I guess Leagues of Votann will still continue to have some good win rate data, even if probably not going to be one of the factions taking as many trophies home. Maybe worth giving a shout out for the Orcs as well. Again, they seem to be doing kind of well at higher levels of play. I feel like the change to WoW will certainly help that, without having to call it at the start of the battle round. In any case though, let me know your thoughts. Which armies and factions do you think will be rising to the top of 40k going forward? Let me know your ideas down in the comments. That's the end of the video, but for those interested I'll just cycle back to the sponsor in Titan's Terrain if you do want an instant deploy cardboard battlefield to pop up out of nowhere. As mentioned, it does have some big pros and cons versus other terrain sets. It's really easy to store and transport, all fitting in one of those boxes. It's far cheaper than a whole board of Games Workshop terrain, at least somewhat comparable to MDF, usually a bit cheaper than most of the other options for a whole battlefield. And of course it doesn't need any painting or assembly, so it's ready to go immediately, which is definitely a selling point to plenty of people. For downsides, it is made of cardboard, so it's less sturdy and hard wearing versus plastic things. It has to be designed to fold flat, and that can also mean it's not quite as easy to put infantry in the top floors of buildings and things, as they're a touch less stable. The grid layout can mean that you have a little bit less flexibility with how you lay out a table and can create some firing lanes. I feel like just throwing in an extra piece or two on top of it might not be the worst idea, and it doesn't really do tournament terrain layouts if that's what you're looking for. For their exact offerings, they've got a few different ones, a Forgotten Furnace one with a whole bunch of glowing chaos runes and factory foundries and things, a more standard Shattered Hive City type one, lots of bombed out buildings, rubble and armoured containers and the like, plus a bit more of a verdant overgrown capital type one, ruins that could be a bit more appropriate to both the fantasy and the grimdark style settings. They've also got some expansion packs as well, basically pushing two tiles together to make a great big building. A cathedral type thing for the city and the capital, and a great big spire for the foundry. In any case, thanks to them for sponsoring this one. Feel free to check them out, linked in the video description if you're interested. In any case though, I'll leave this one there for now though. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I do tend to post new videos just about every day. Check out the Patreon page and the channel's affiliate discount links for Warhammer down in the video description if you'd like to support the videos. A massive thank you to anyone doing so for that. And otherwise, an absolutely enormous thank you for listening. I'll hope to see you guys next time.